Good afternoon, and welcome to our New York Archives Magazine online speaker series. I'm New York State Archivist Tom Ruller, and we're very pleased to co-sponsor today's program with the New Netherland Institute. Today, I'm joined by New Netherland Research Center Director Charles Gehring, author and researcher Jaap Jacobs, and Professor of History and International Relations Wim Klooster. As we recognize the 400th anniversary of the granting of a charter by the States General of the Netherlands to the Dutch West India Company on June 3rd, 1621, to operate what eventually became the colony of New Netherlands. Dr. Charles Gehring is the director of the New Netherland Research Center, leading the New Netherland Project. The project is responsible for translating the official records of the Dutch colony and promoting awareness of the Dutch role in American history. He's been a fellow of the Holland Society of New York since 1979. Jaap Jacobs is an internationally recognized authority on New Netherland and Dutch New York. He's taught at universities in the Netherlands, the United States, and is currently affiliated with the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. His current book project is a biography of Petrus Stuyvesant, Director General of New Netherlands. Wim Klooster is professor and Robert H. and Virginia N. Scotland Endowed Chair in History and International Relations at Clark University, where he has taught since 2003. His latest books are Spanish-American Independence Movements, A History in Documents, and Realm Between Empires, the Second Dutch Atlantic, 1680 to 1815. He's currently editing the 3-volume Cambridge history of the Age of Atlantic Revolutions. I am very pleased and honored to introduce Charlie, Jaap, and Wim as we discuss the origins of the Dutch West India Company. Charlie, can I start with you with a question? What was the context of the establishment of the West India Company?
The context was a very turbulent, tumultuous time in the Netherlands. I imagine it was for Spain as well, but we'll have to start at the beginning, at the end of the 15th century. The 17 provinces that made up the Lage Landen, the Low Countries, had become part of the Habsburg Empire. When the Duchess Mary of Burgundy married Prince Maximilian of the House of Habsburg. This put the Low Countries and most of what is the Netherlands today in a global empire. The Habsburg Empire could boast that the sun never set on its lands around the world, and it was fairly true. And by the 16th century, Charles, the grandson of this marriage, Charles V, had become emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Not only was he emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, but he was King Charles I of Spain and Archduke of the Austrian Habsburg holdings in Eastern Europe. So a very powerful force in most of the 16th century. So the Dutch were involved in all of these operations. It was a two-edged sword for the Dutch in a way. They had become a distribution center for the international trade and commerce, leading in trade with England, becoming a dominant force in the Baltic, eventually a dominant force in the Mediterranean as well. But the other side of the blade, if you want, was they got involved in all of the wars that the Habsburgs were involved in at the time. And the biggest enemy for the Habsburgs were the Ottoman Turks. Not only were they threatening Vienna through the Balkans, but they were also disturbing a lot of commerce in the Mediterranean at that time. The son of Charles the First, or Charles, I'll bring him up to the Holy Roman Empire, Charles the Fifth. He was very fond of the Dutch, spoke Dutch, was born in Ghent, in what is now Belgium, and was fond of the House of Nassau. In fact, the person standing next to him when he abdicated his position, or the throne, was the Prince of Orange, Willem I. Not only did he support him figuratively, but was literally supporting him because Charles V was not in very, very good condition at that time. Everything was going along just fine for the Dutch, as being part of the Habsburg Empire, taking advantage of world trade routes and learning a lot about global navigation until the Reformation occurred, and John Calvin made a very strong impression among the Dutch, and they had adopted his doctrine of the Protestant Reformed religion. The Habsburgs were ardent Catholics, and they considered what the Dutch were doing was heresy, especially the son of Charles V, Philip II. He did not particularly like the Dutch to begin with, but now with them being heretics, it made it even worse. And he targeted the Netherlands. The Netherlands really suffered the most for being Protestants as a result of their adoption of Calvinism. I have read that there were probably more deaths as a result of their profession of Calvinism than any other place in Europe. So the Dutch were struggling with two problems, a religious and a political problem, and began a revolt against the Habsburgs. And I should say maybe the Spanish at this time, the Spanish Habsburgs. It'll be easier to remember if I just say Spanish than Habsburg. They started the revolt in 1568, and it would lead to a war that would last for 80 years. And it not only started out really as a redress of grievances. There are a lot of characteristics in common with our revolt against the English. Originally starting out as a redress of grievances, but then leading to outright war. With the Dutch, it started out as a redress. A Union of Utrecht took place in 1579, and the seven upper provinces north of the great rivers formed a defensive pact against Spain, but they were still holding their allegiance to Philip II at that time. It wasn't until 1581 that they abjured their oath to Philip II. And it's a very strong move. It's similar to our Declaration of Independence. In fact, if you read the abjuration of the oath, it sounds a lot like the beginning of our Declaration of Independence. It remains to be seen whether whether the abjuration actually did influence our oath. That's something for future research. I know people are working on it right now. Well, once they cut their ties with Spain, they were left on their own. And all of a sudden, they were traveling in waters that were no longer friendly to them, but were hostile. And they had to find their own sea routes, their own way of navigating so that they could maximize their profits and support their economy at home. And one of the trades that they wanted to exploit the most was in the Far East. And it was mostly the spice trade that the Portuguese had begun some years before. And the Dutch went in very strongly with cartels of merchants supplying capital for fleets. At one point, there, I think, 60 some ships, Dutch ships in the Far East, taking over various Portuguese trading posts and establishing a trade network. And this, of course, leads to all kinds of problems. The bottom line for a business is that your worst enemy is competition. And they were getting competition from other groups in the Netherlands as well. Once those first ships came back, let's say Van Neck in 1599 with tons of pepper and nutmeg and other spices and mace, ships, other merchants wanted to be part of the action. So this led to the chartering of an East India Company in 1602. And there had been talk about a West India Company at that time through Willem Huyslinks. He was a refugee from Antwerp, escaping persecution of Spain. He was a Protestant, and he was very much against the Catholics and against Spain as a result of that, and had been talking very strongly about establishing a West India Company. But there was also talk at this time about a truce. They had been fighting since 1568, and both sides were pretty much exhausted, and they were leading into a stalemate. And the one thing that the Spanish did not want to see was another company taking over their possessions. Portugal in 1580 had become part of the Spanish crown. It was sort of inherited by the King of Spain for a period of time. It would remain part of Spain until 1640. Thank you. And the Spanish, I've lost my train of thought now. The Spanish were exhausted, you could say, and they were more or less saying that yeah, we can lead to a truce. They were negotiating for a ceasefire actually in 1607 that would eventually lead to a truce. But they were having problems with the Dutch saying, well, we'll give you your independence or recognize you, these 7 provinces above the rivers, as a sovereign power if you no longer, if you disband the East India Company, forget about the West India Company, and not navigate below the equator. And this to the Dutch was impossible. And they never would put it down in writing, but apparently the Spanish actually did put down in writing that they would recognize the Dutch as a result of an agreement, of this ceasefire agreement. The whole thing came to a head in April of 1607, when the Dutch managed to catch the Spanish fleet in the Bay of Gibraltar. There was a confrontation, and the Dutch ended up destroying the entire Spanish fleet, 10 galleons, 21 ships altogether, and probably they say 2,000 to 3,000 men. The Dutch lost the captain van Heemskerk, but lost no ships. And this was shortly after, you have to remember, the Spanish Armada in 1588. It's only 20 years later. Now the Dutch or the Spanish lost another large fleet of ships. So the truce was agreed upon. This was probably stimulated by this loss in 1607. The truce began in 1609 and would last for 12 years. It was negotiated to 12 years. Originally, they were talking about only 8 years. Well, immediately there was it divided into two factions in the Netherlands. One who wanted to renew the truce at the end in 1621, and the other who wanted to go back to war with Spain. And this argument was also exacerbated by a religious argument that cropped up at the same time over predestination. Two theologians at Leiden were arguing about the doctrine of predestination. One side viewed it as very conservatively, the other side liberally. They more or less divided into, they're called remonstrants and anti-remonstrants, or hawks and doves. And they were pretty much at one another's throats for this period of time. You would think for the 12 years truce, things would ease up and it would be a time of recuperation and restoration and so forth, but it was a time of turmoil and almost a civil war. The leader of the Doves was a man by the name of Oldenbarneveldt. He was the Landsadvocaat of Holland, and something like our Speaker of the House. He had a great deal of authority, and he was the leader of the Dove party. On the other side, eventually Prince Maurits, the son of William of Orange, became the leader of the Hawks, to the point where he apparently saw that this was his future, and this is where he would be able to exert the most power. He had Oldenbarneveldt and Hugo de Grotius arrested. Oldenbarneveldt for treason in 1618, and eventually the following year, on May 13th of 1619, Oldenbarneveldt is beheaded in The Hague, and Maurits begins to replace remonstrance in the various cities with counter remonstrance. And by the time the truce expires in 1621, the die is cast and war is begun again with Spain, and the West India Company is established basically as a means of carrying on the war in the Atlantic Ocean. But the actual region that the West India Company is given for its operations is from the west coast of Africa, west across the Americas to the easternmost reaches of the Indonesian archipelago. So it's a massive territory. And this is where Wim comes in to tell us what happens after the West India Company is founded in this, and given the job of administering this huge expanse of territory.
Before we go there, can I ask just a simple question? Today marks the 400th anniversary of the granting of a charter by the States General. I'm just going to say the States General was the government of the Netherlands. Is that a correct?
The States General was responsible for foreign affairs. They were the sovereign power in the Netherlands, but mostly for foreign affairs. This is why the East India Company was so important as an operation. It was, you could look at it as a way of privatizing foreign policy. The East India Company could raise its own army, navy, and had responsibility for war and peace in the under its control. So it was a privatization of foreign policy, but this was the authority of the States General being able to allow this for a number of 21 years or so. Then it would be reconsidered and renewed. Got
it. Well, and that I think does bring us to Wim. Can you talk a little bit about the West India Company and what was their scope? You know, the charter gave them pretty expansive powers. They, again, as Charlie just said, they privatized foreign policy or foreign relations through this company. What was the West India Company's responsibility?
Yeah, so it's a company that is modeled on the East India Company. But whereas the East India Company was active in the Indian Ocean, the West India Company would be active in the Atlantic Ocean. And formerly, it had a number of tasks. Formerly, it was a commercial company with a whole range of monopolies, at least in the beginning. It was also a company that had to take care of migration, of bringing settlers to the various colonies that were going to be established. But by far the most important task throughout the existence of this first West India Company, because there will be a second one starting in 1674-75, but this first West India Company was first and foremost a war machine. It engaged in warfare with what was by then called, by 1621, at the moment of the foundation of the company, the hereditary enemy, because they had inherited, the Dutch had inherited the enemy from previous generations. And it would continue to be, of course, an important enemy in the decades to come. As Charlie was saying, Spain and Portugal were united under one crown since 1580. And when you look at where the Dutch, through the East and the West India Company, wage war on a global scale, is in the first place by making war on the Portuguese. So the Portuguese were the dominant European power in the Indian Ocean, and they suffer losses in terms of trading stations, but also in terms of trade and traded connections to the Dutch throughout the Indian Ocean. from Taiwan to Sri Lanka to what becomes Indonesia. And the same then happens in the Atlantic Ocean. So the West India Company has some trouble getting started. The number of investors is not very large. Certainly it pales in comparison to what had happened when the East India Company got started in 1602. And it's only by 1623 that the first important board meeting is held. And at that meeting, the decision is made to engage in what they called a groot design, a grand design. You can consider this a design on the Atlantic world. And it's a very ambitious one. It's a very optimistic one on the part of the West India Company directors. What they try to do is to carve out basically a Dutch empire in the Atlantic world at the cost of the Spanish and the Portuguese. So again, Spain and Portugal were united under this Habsburg crown, under the Spanish crown. And what the Dutch did in the first place after that meeting is get ready for an expedition to Brazil. There had been debates on which might be the weakest link in this combined Spanish and Portuguese empire. And some had said, well, Cuba is a significant island, but it's a bit neglected by the Spanish crown compared to Mexico and Peru. So let's start trying to conquer that island. Others had said Brazil is actually in the hands of the Portuguese, but the Portuguese are not very happy with the Spanish Union. So that might be easy pickings, because the Portuguese could be considered to side with us, to ally with us. And eventually the decision is made to send an expedition to the capital of Brazil, Salvador da Bahia. And that is successful. So they start out on a good footing. They started successfully. They capture the capital of Brazil, but they also lose it again within a year. And that's the beginning of almost everything going wrong that possibly could go wrong, because the Dutch had not just sent a fleet to Brazil, they also sent a fleet to what is now the country of Angola, which was the main spot in Africa where Europeans at that point in time purchased enslaved Africans and brought them to the Americas. The Portuguese were the great slave traders at the time, not just trading slaves to their own colony in Brazil, but also to various Spanish outlets in Havana, in what is now Colombia, in Panama, etc. So the Dutch tried to conquer that particular place. They failed initially. They also failed in capturing another Portuguese trading station much farther to the north in what is now the country of Ghana, on the Gold Coast, called Elmina. At least that's how the Dutch called it. And they fail in that design as well. They also failed to conquer Puerto Rico. So within a few years, almost everything has gone wrong. They lose Salvador da Bahia. Within a year, they don't manage to extend their empire. But they don't just wage war ashore. The Dutch are also very active in waging war on the waters, on the Atlantic Ocean, and largely targeting Portuguese sugar ships. So Portugal had a colony, and now, of course, it's part of this larger Habsburg Empire. Brazil was the largest sugar producer in the world. And the Dutch, having fallen short of conquering Brazil itself, now try to make up for that by capturing sugar ship that went back and forth between Brazil and Portugal. And they're highly successful in doing that, capturing hundreds of ships, which also means that a lot of Brazilian sugar ends up in the market in Amsterdam. So that is clearly a success, but they crown their success in waging this maritime war in 1628, when they, after years of spying on the Spanish fleets, not the Portuguese, but the Spanish fleets, managed to capture a Spanish treasure fleet. So the way that Spain had organized its Atlantic system economically was by protecting ships that went from Mexico and Peru to Spain laden with silver. 90% of the value of the commodities that came from America to Spain were accounted for by silver. So silver was their big key to success. And the Dutch knew that. And one reason for the Dutch to actually extend the war effort from the Low Countries to the Americas was the idea, the notion that this is, in the Americas, where the Spanish gather the wealth that enabled them to wage the war with the Dutch in the first place. So if we are able to perhaps capture the silver mine in America, but short of doing that, at least are able to capture silver that is transported back and forth from the Americas to Spain, we might not just harm the enemy, but enrich ourselves. So they knew where the fleets went. They knew when they left. And on this occasion in 1628 in September, the Dutch had their act together after having, closely missed some fleets in previous years. This time on the northern coast of Cuba in a bay, they're able to capture the entire treasure fleet with a tremendous amount of silver on board, which when it is finally coined and when the accounts are made up in Amsterdam, once the silver has been stored, enables the Dutch to do a number of different things. One is to help a siege in the very south of the Low Countries and at the city of Den Bosch, Bois-le-Duc, as the French called it, which is very successful, and it is a reversal in the war with Spain. But for our purposes, what is important is that they also use the money to return to Brazil. So the momentum had been lost, but it's regained now in 1628 with the capture of this treasure fleet, which is still a feat that is sometimes commemorated in the Netherlands to this very day. When the Dutch national soccer team is winning a game, at the very end of the game, somebody will start the song about the Silver Fleet, how Piet Hein, whose name is small, was able to accomplish an enormously big deed, and that is defeating the Spanish. And then the whole crowd, 60,000 chimes into this song. So it's Piet Hein has not been forgotten, the man who was the admiral ultimately responsible for this feat. So the Dutch returned to Brazil, this time not to the capital city, but to the northeast, to the area where sugar is cultivated. And they capture, little by little, an enormous area. In the end, by 1642, it's about half of the entire territory of Brazil, which is in Dutch hands. And the Dutch are also successful on the other side of the Atlantic in Africa, where in 1637 they conquer Elmina from the Portuguese, and in 1641 Angola from the Portuguese. So now all of a sudden they have an empire that stretches the Atlantic. At the same time, 1642 is also the height of their power in the Atlantic. And this is, of course, all the time while New Netherland is being constructed. But New Netherland is, you might say, aloof from these developments. Of course, there are some connections, but this New Netherland is not a colony that is fought over between the Dutch and the Iberians. The Dutch count on Brazil. This is going to be the jewel in their crown. They don't have a crown, of course, of their own, but this is going to be the most important colony in the Atlantic world, and that is reflected in the paperwork, the correspondences of the West India Company and between the West India Company and the States General about Brazil. It's also reflected in the sheer number of soldiers and sailors that are sent to Brazil on a very regular basis. The other colonies combined are really dwarfed by this enormous effort to not just maintain, but also to expand Dutch rule in Brazil. In 1645, there's a revolt against Dutch rule by the Portuguese settlers, and it means that almost immediately the Dutch lose a large amount of territory. And on top of that, they lose two major battles fought right outside of Recife, of the Dutch capital, in 1648 and 1649. If these battles had gone the other way, if the Dutch had won, it remains to be seen what had happened, what would have happened subsequently. But now it really leads to the Dutch being confined just to their capital city, where they find themselves embattled. The soldiers are not paid very well. The sailors are not paid very well. In the end, many of them don't want to fight anymore. And in 1654, when the Portuguese fleet arrives, there's almost no defense force anymore. The Dutch Navy has gone. There's just one ship to defend this entire colony. And many of the soldiers don't want to fight. So the Dutch simply surrender their colony, and basically repeating what had happened 6 years before in Angola, where a similar sequence had taken place. The Dutch don't give up on Brazil after having surrendered this colony. They try to negotiate with the Portuguese, and at some point the Portuguese king, who is by now back in business, in 1640 the Portuguese have rebelled against Spain. They are independent, which means that Brazil is now back as a full-fledged Portuguese colony. That Portuguese king is almost willing at some point during these negotiations to give at least one part of his colony of Brazil to the Dutch. The Dutch are satisfied with that. They want the entire thing. And in hindsight, that of course is a missed chance, but they keep negotiating, and there's a peace treaty in 1661 and another one in 1668. And in the end, the Dutch are basically signing off on a deal which says we give up on Brazil in exchange for being able to load a tremendous amount of salt in Portugal year after year after year. And that's how they lose Brazil. And for many years to come, there's a nostalgia about Brazil. What would have happened if we had held on to our prized colony in Brazil? Brazil also is a colony that leads indirectly to the bankruptcy of the West India Company. So much money is spent there that from a very early date on, the West India Company has to go to the States General and ask for what they call subsidies. We need to be able to wage these wars. We have no money anymore. And it means that the different states, the 7 states that form the State General, have to come up with money. And that is an issue because some of the states, especially the interior provinces, are not very eager to finance a war that is a distant war in which they have no stake, in which they don't see much promise. But at the same time, enough money does come forward for quite a number of fleets to be fitted out and to help out in maintaining Dutch Brazil. But the West India Company has as early as the mid-1630s, they're teetering on bankruptcy. And they're saved a number of times. But by 1674, so 20 years after the loss of Brazil, finally the decision is made to declare bankruptcy. And it is then reestablished very quickly, but as a very different kind of company that is no longer a war machine, that has no military arm whatsoever. It's basically a company about governance, and it will continue to exist until 1791, but it's a very pale reflection of what once was a very mighty company, especially in the 1620s and 1630s.
So it sounds like there's a big shift, and the loss of Brazil and the fact that really we've got an unprofitable company that's able to exist because of, now here's a new word, government bailouts. Which enabled it to continue to operate. But particularly in New Netherland, but I assume throughout all of the West India Company's holdings, for lack of a better, or territory, there was a system of governance. The charter itself talks about the Director General and someone who is responsible for overseeing the colony. Jaap, can you talk a little bit about how the West India Company sort of operated within the colonies and what its role was and how it governed?
As far as New Netherland was concerned, the West India Company basically was the government. Director General and Council acted on behalf of the Amsterdam Chamber. Of course, the West India Company had 5 chambers in all, But it was the Amsterdam Company that from the 1620s onwards played a major role, and from 1645 actually ruled New Netherland exclusively, without any say by any of the other chambers, to their great dislike, I need to add. So what the Amsterdam Chamber did, what the directors did there, is correspond with their servants, the company servants, in New Netherland. That correspondence forms a large part of the archive of New Netherland, that is, of course, in the New York State Archives. In New Netherland, Director General and Council, as they are called from 1647 onwards, basically are, as I said, government. So they run the colony, they are in charge of the justice system, which is based on Dutch Roman law. They act as a court of appeal in civil matters. They deal with the major criminal matters, not with the minor ones, but the major ones. And they have the standard duties of supreme government, for instance, defense against external enemies, taking care of forts and garrisons, maintaining relations with Native Americans and with the neighboring colonies. And that is done, as I said, through a collective body called the Director General and Council. All of these were appointed from Amsterdam. In some cases, someone was provisionally appointed in the colony, but those appointments had to be approved by Amsterdam, and that usually happened. So it's from 1647 onwards Stuyvesant. There are, of course, predecessors of him, Kieft, Van Twiller, before him, who with councillors runs the entire colony, not just New Amsterdam, but the entire area in which there are Dutch settlers. So the councillors are either full professionals, for instance, the secretary, for the large part Cornelis van Rijven, or the vice director. There are a number of those over the years, and a few other councillors as well. There's also a small apparatus of clerks, a bookkeeper and such, and 200 to 250 soldiers. This is the group that regularly meets in the council chamber in Fort Amsterdam, on the tip of Manhattan, of course, where now the Smithsonian Institution for Native American Indian is, which is sort of an irony of history, I suppose. In these meetings, everyone has a single vote, but the Director General has a casting vote in case that is required. So there is no system of autocracy. This is quite different actually from the usual way that the English run their colonies, in which the governor has more individual power. Stuyvesant did not have that kind of formal authority, but through the force of his personality and his wide experience and his conviction as well, he had the main say in what would happen. The standard procedure is that matters are discussed and then put to a vote, and there could be either unanimity or sometimes a majority vote. In very important cases, all the councillors get the paper, the decision that is being prepared, and are asked to put in writing their own opinion on it, which then is, of course, their advice. This is not just for them to make up their own minds, but also as a kind of corroboration of the collective decision that is being taken. The Director General and Council always have to report back to Amsterdam, which has the final say on many matters. So in all of these matters go back to Amsterdam and are deliberated there by people who think they know what is going on. It's increasingly clear, however, that the directors in Amsterdam are not sufficiently aware of what is actually happening in the colony. And the correspondence shows signs of Stuyvesant, who signs all the correspondence, but it is still collective correspondence, getting a little annoyed at times at the inability of his superiors to understand what is going on. So there are several matters that they discuss in 1648, for instance, the 9th of September. To give just an example, they are discussing a letter of the governor of New Sweden on the Delaware River, a report of the commissary there, Andries Hudde. They also discuss his accounts because he has an expense account. There is an ordinance in draft that should prohibit the wrong marking of beaver skins to avoid any payments on it. There's a proposal to appoint a guardian over minor children, and there is an ordinance for the regulation of wampum. And that's just all a regular agenda. Now, what they do here is not, they don't make minutes as we do, but it's actually a resolution system. So they only note down the resolutions that are taken. And for the time frame from 1647 to 1664, these are 4,500 pages that are in your archive. And that's all kinds of stuff that is resolutions, depositions, reports, remonstrances, orders, and a few letters. But it's distinct from the batch of correspondence that is more general, which is also, of course, in the New York State Archives. So at this point in time, when Stuyvesant takes over, the West India Company in New Netherland is, as I said, government. But it had taken 20 years to get to that stage. New Netherland, of course, starts out under West India Company rule with a monopoly on the fur trade and on shipping to New Netherland. That gradually gets eroded until about 1640, when the West India Company allows colonists and others to engage in the fur trade. And they also allow shipping to and from the company to be carried out by what we might call third parties, by private merchants, who do have to pay what is called a recognition fee for that. That recognition is an acknowledgement of the authority of the West India Company to have a monopoly, even if they have already decided that they're chartering out that monopoly to the individual parties, but it's still a governmental entity. So the West India Company for New Netherland by that time is no longer a commercial entity. It does have financial responsibilities, however. Some of the expenses of the government in New Netherlands, the colonial government, are paid for from Amsterdam, but most of what is going on has to be paid in New Amsterdam from the imposts, the taxes that the New Netherland Council itself has to take. So that is the basic way that the company runs its affairs in New Netherland. And in many ways, if you look at the whole administrative system, this is pretty similar to what was going on both in the Netherlands, but also in other colonies. For New Netherland, we don't have as many documents as we do for Brazil, for instance. There's much more there, but the administrative recording system is pretty much the same. So that is an interesting way to look at it, because allowing, if you look at the way that matters are recorded, you can more easily as a historian see through the records and see what they represent. The whole activity of what is being recorded, what is left out, to what other papers they are referring to. If you have knowledge of that, which I think is required knowledge for a historian, then you are better able to interpret what is going on in New Netherland. Tom? You're mute.
But I often am criticized for having my lips move but saying nothing. But that's a different context. We're going to have time for a couple of quick questions, but I'd like to start off with a couple. One, when you mentioned that the Dutch took over Angola, and so that would mean that they were engaged in the slave trade. Can you talk a little bit about the Dutch role and within the exchange of enslaved people and what that meant for the West India Company in particular?
Yes, the Dutch Atlantic slave trade did not amount to much before the Dutch captured large parts of northeastern Brazil in the mid-1630s. So I think about a dozen Dutch directed slave voyages have been documented before then. But then all of a sudden it takes off. So it begins with Brazil, with their own colony. The estimate is that about 25,000 Africans were transported on Dutch ships from Africa to Brazil during Dutch rule. When the Dutch then lose Brazil and thereby lose the outlets of the enslaved people that they're transporting, they don't give up on the transatlantic slave trade. And some Africans end up in the Netherlands, some will end up in Curacao, which in this period is still a minor colony. But soon enough, by the early 1660s, Curacao develops into a major entrepot, a place from where the Dutch can send enslaved people to the Spanish colonies, and that's what they start doing. The Dutch also, in this very same period, in the 1660s, almost monopolized the slave trade to the French Caribbean colonies. And therefore, in these periods during the Dutch Golden Age, and between 1640 and 1670, I've once calculated this, the Dutch are responsible for almost half of the transatlantic slave trade, which is a very different figure from the one you usually hear, which is 5%. So when we talk about the entire history of the European trade in enslaved Africans from the early 16th century to the 1860s, during that entire period when about 12.5 million Africans are transported from Africa to the New World, only about 5%, perhaps 6%, are transported on Dutch ships. But if we focus on just that particular period that I mentioned, in the heyday of the Dutch activities in the Atlantic world, it's certainly over 40% that is carried on Dutch ships.
Great, thank you. Jaap, you talk about the government of the West India Company, and particularly the government of New Netherlands. But is it fair to characterize the patroon system as a parallel government? Now, what was the relationship between the company and the patroons? I'm here in Albany, in Beverwijk, looking across the river at the Van Rensselaer Manor and wondering what's going on over there during this time period.
Well, the patroonship system, not just for New Netherlands, but in general in the West India Company, starts in the late 1620s. Within the Amsterdam Chamber, which was running New Netherlands, there was already the idea that either we go for trade and invest as little as we can, or we go for colonization, and that actually would allow the West India Company to build up a stronger colony. However, colonization, as many people have discovered over the ages, is a very expensive and risky investment. So the West India Company, which at that point has its windfall with, as Wim mentioned, the capture of the treasure fleet, allows the private merchants to invest in these patroon ships. And there are several of those planned, including Swanendaal on the Delaware, Pavonia in New Jersey, and a couple of others as well. Actually, Van Rensselaer is the only one who's slightly successful. Within a few years, most of these patroon ships, which are basically grants of authority rather than grants of land, are sold back to the West India Company. By the 1640s, the West India Company starts again with a plan for this. And by that time, we have David Pietersen de Vries, who is the patroon of Staten Island, Adriaan van der Donck, who has his own Kolendonk patroon ship in the Bronx. And there are a few others as well, although their powers in terms of justice are not as extensive as those of the first generation of patroon ship. Now, if you compare this with what is going on in the Netherlands at the time, it's comparable to the whole system of manors. Manors are in fact also transferable powers, either of government and usually justice as well. So it's pretty similar. It's a privatization of governmental and judicial powers that is going on. The last of the patroonships is actually the city colony of Amsterdam in 1656 when it started, which is New Amstel. And that is, if you look at the technical arrangement, the legal arrangement, it is pretty much a patroonship, which means that they are subordinate governmental entities under the aegis of the West India Company.
Very good. So technically, there were sort of the West India Company was the uber government, and then you have the Director General on one side and the patroon on the other side. Very good.
Yeah. It did mean, of course, that not all of the patroons quite agreed with limitations to their powers, and several conflicts arose on several levels. In the Rensselaerswyck situation, the whole creation of Beverwijk in 1652 is an example of that. So Albany was born out of conflict.
We'll keep that in mind. We have just a couple of minutes left. Are there any questions from the audience? If you just want to type them into the Q&A, we'll try to get to them. But before we wrap up, I want to just share a little bit, and this is to some extent a shameless plug for the New York State Archives, but also for the New Netherland Institute. Jaap talked a lot about the documents from New Netherland that are here at the New York State Archives, and if you're interested in looking at them and seeing those that you can that have been translated, our website, every single one of those documents has been digitized and is available online. And where there's a translation, that's available, and where and for those that aren't translated, and for all of them, there's some basic information that we call it metadata in the archives world. The date, who wrote it, what the brief subject is, and all of that is there, and it's fully searchable. So there's a great opportunity to dive a little bit deeper. If you're particularly interested in the reason we're celebrating today, June 3rd, 2021, going back to June 3rd, 1621, the actual charter to the West India Company by the States General has been translated and published. It was published by New York State in, I think, like 1909, something like that, as part of the Van Rensselaer-Bauer, I'm not saying the name correctly, manuscripts, but you can find that, a scanned version of that document on the New Netherland Institute website. A simple Google search will bring you right there, and you'll be able to read the charter, which is pretty extensive and helps shed, and you can read it in both English and Van Laar's Dutch, I only stuck to the English pages, which were enlightening to me, but it's very much worthwhile taking a look at. So I think we're just about out of time, but I want to say thank you very much, Charlie, Wim, Jaap. This was enlightening. I mean, and all history is context, and you've given us context that goes back quite some time, long before when Columbus was sailing around the Atlantic. And so to help us understand and put New Netherland and what's happening here in our country and the whole North America and South America into a much better context, and helps us understand where New York came from, how New Netherland got us here, and where New Netherland came from. So thank you very much for that. I think everyone, I know me, and I know everyone learned a lot. And again, it's very, very helpful. And thank you all very much for sharing. It's our privilege at the State Archives and the State Archives Partnership Trust to make these events available to you, the audience, and to keep New York State's history alive and to put it into that broader context, to help us all understand where we came from, and help us understand better where we're going to go. If you're interested in the content we create and want more, please contact us. Our email address, aptrust@nysed.gov. If you do that, you'll receive a free past issue of the New York Archives magazine, which is the sponsor of these speaker series. And if you want to stay up to date on our current events through our website or our social media channels, visit our website, www.nysarchivestrust.org, or learn about the New Netherland Institute. And again, it's newnetherlandinstitute.org. There's a lot to learn. We covered in an hour a whole lot, but we really need several hours to figure it all out. So again, thank you all very much. Thank you for participating today. And we will see you at our next online speaker series.